Right now, in this exact moment, something is happening inside your brain that you have never been told about. When you close your eyes and sit in absolute silence, your brain does not rest. It activates. A distributed network of neural circuits spread across your entire cortex lights up simultaneously, consuming nearly 80% of the brain's total energy budget, even while you believe you are doing nothing. This network is called the default mode network, and it is running right now, inside your skull, constructing the single most convincing illusion in the known universe. You. The complete, internally consistent, continuously updated story of who you are, what you have done, what people think of you, and what is going to happen next. Every loop of anxiety you have ever experienced, every replay of an embarrassing memory, every rehearsal of a conversation that never happened. That was the default mode network doing exactly what it was built to do. Your suffering is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working. And for the last 20 years, neuroscientists have been quietly unraveling why, and discovering what happens to the human mind when this network goes completely silent. What they found changes everything about how you understand your inner life. The default mode network was not discovered by looking for it. It was discovered by accident. In the late 1990s, a neurologist named Marcus Raichle was running brain imaging experiments at Washington University in St. Louis. The protocol was standard. Give subjects a cognitive task, measure which brain regions activate, then scan the resting brain as a baseline. But when subjects stopped their tasks and simply rested, certain brain regions did not return to baseline. They increased their activity above baseline. The brain was measurably working harder when it was supposed to be resting. Raichle published his findings in 2001 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, calling the phenomenon the brain's default mode, its natural state of operation when not engaged with the external world. The paper was initially met with skepticism. The prevailing assumption had always been that the resting brain was simply idling. Raichle had discovered it was anything but. The default mode network is not a single brain region. It is a distributed constellation of structures that activate together in precise coordination. The medial prefrontal cortex, just behind your forehead, handles self-referential thought. Questions like, what do I want, and how do others see me? The posterior cingulate cortex, near the center back of the brain, acts as an autobiographical hub, integrating memories with present context to build a coherent personal timeline. The angular gyrus, near your temples, processes language, meaning, and social interpretation. The hippocampus, the brain's memory indexing system, feeds the network a constant stream of past experiences. Together, these structures form a machine for constructing narrative. The narrative they construct is the story of you. Neuroscientists call this the narrative self, the continuous inner monologue that ties your past, present, and projected future into a single coherent character. Antonio Damasio at the University of Southern California has spent decades studying how the brain generates selfhood, and his research suggests that what we experience as I is not a fixed entity, but a real-time construction, a story the brain tells itself about itself. The default mode network is the storytelling machine, and it never stops. Even during sleep, the network remains partially active, weaving memory into the narrative sequences we call dreams. From the moment you wake to the moment you lose consciousness, it is generating the sensation of being you. In 2010, psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard University published one of the most unsettling studies in the history of happiness research. They developed a smartphone app that contacted subjects at random intervals throughout the day, asking what they were doing, what they were thinking about, and how happy they felt. Over the course of the study, they collected 250,000 data points from over 2,000 people across 80 countries. The finding was devastating in its simplicity. The human mind wanders from what it is doing 47% of the time. Nearly half of every waking hour, your thoughts are somewhere else. And when your mind wanders, you are less happy, regardless of what activity you are engaged in. Killingsworth and Gilbert titled their paper, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." That wandering mind is the default mode network, generating simulations of the past and future. It is replaying what went wrong last Tuesday. It is rehearsing what might go wrong next Tuesday. It is running a continuous social simulation, modeling every relationship in your life, updating it with new information, flagging threats, and calculating whether you are liked or not. This is cognitively exhausting work, and it is your brain's default. The reason is evolutionary. Humans are an intensely social species, and social threats, rejection, loss of status, group exclusion, were genuinely life-threatening for most of our evolutionary history. A brain that could simulate other minds, predict social dynamics, and rehearse future interactions in advance would have had an enormous survival advantage. The default mode network evolved to run this simulation continuously, burning enormous energy to keep the social model current, because the cost of being wrong was death. It also evolved to be conservative, biased toward threat detection, toward negative interpretation, toward catastrophic projection, because overestimating danger costs energy, but underestimating it costs your life. This is why the network does not generate neutral simulations. It generates anxious ones. It amplifies social pain, replays failures more vividly than successes, and constructs future scenarios weighted toward worst-case outcomes. This is not a malfunction. This is the algorithm running as designed. But there is a catastrophic mismatch between the environment the algorithm was designed for and the one it now runs in. You are no longer being hunted. The threats the default mode network is managing are largely symbolic: a critical email, a social slight, a fear of being perceived as inadequate. But the threat detection circuitry does not distinguish between a predator and a performance review. It responds to both with the same corrosive loop of stress hormones and intrusive simulations. And for many people, this loop never turns off. Clinical depression is not simply feeling sad. Neuroscientific research over the past 2 decades has consistently shown that depression is characterized by hyperactivity of the default mode network, specifically the self-referential circuits. A 2009 study by Johnson and colleagues at Stanford University found that depressed individuals show significantly elevated activity in the medial prefrontal cortex during rest compared to healthy controls. The network is trapped in a loop of self-focused negative thought, replaying failures, anticipating rejection, constructing narratives of worthlessness. Psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema at Yale University spent her career studying this pattern, which she called rumination, the repetitive, passive focus on symptoms of distress and their causes. Her research showed that rumination doesn't solve problems. It amplifies them, deepens depression, and actively interferes with problem solving. The network that evolved to protect you is, for many people, actively perpetuating their suffering. Which brings us to the question neuroscientists began asking in the early 2000s. What happens when you turn it off? The first answers came not from a pharmaceutical lab, but from a compound that humans have consumed for at least 10,000 years: psilocybin. The active molecule in psilocybin mushrooms is a serotonin receptor agonist. It mimics serotonin at specific receptor sites throughout the brain, particularly the 5-HT2A receptors densely distributed across the cortex. For most of modern medicine's history, psilocybin was classified as a Schedule I substance. No accepted medical use, high potential for abuse, and rigorous scientific research into its effects was effectively impossible. In 2006, Johns Hopkins University received permission to conduct the first modern controlled study of psilocybin's effects on human consciousness. The lead researcher was Roland Griffiths, a psychopharmacologist who had spent his career studying drug addiction. What Griffiths found was not what mainstream science had expected. Subjects given psilocybin reported experiences of profound personal significance, feelings of unity, sacredness, deeply felt positive mood, and a sense that what they had experienced was more real than real. More than 60% rated their psilocybin session as one of the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives. 14 months later, the majority reported sustained positive changes in mood, attitude, and behavior. The scientific community was skeptical. The language of the reports, unity, transcendence, ego dissolution, sounded less like neuroscience and more like spiritual testimony. Then, in 2012, a team at Imperial College London, led by neuroscientist Robin Carhart-Harris, did something no one had done before. They put people on psilocybin inside a functional MRI scanner, and they watched what happened to the brain in real time. What they saw was not activation, it was deactivation. The regions showing the most dramatic reduction in activity were not random. They were precisely the core hubs of the default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. The more profoundly the default mode network was suppressed, the more completely subjects reported ego dissolution, the total cessation of the felt sense of being a separate, bounded self. Carhart-Harris published his findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012. The correlation was stark. Psilocybin directly and specifically dismantles the neural architecture of the narrative self. What subjects reported during ego dissolution is worth pausing on. They did not report unconsciousness. They reported heightened awareness, more vivid sensory experience, not less. But the narrator, the inner voice that says, "I am experiencing this," had fallen silent. What remained was experience without an experiencer. Subjects described expanded spatial awareness, as though the boundaries of the self had dissolved into the surrounding environment. Some described merging with music, with light, with the room itself. Others described a felt sense, not merely intellectual, of profound unity with everything around them. Carhart-Harris subsequently developed what he called the entropic brain hypothesis. The default mode network, he argued, functions as the brain's primary constraint system, imposing structure on sensory experience, maintaining a stable self-model, and filtering the vast majority of incoming information in accordance with pre-existing beliefs. Psilocybin temporarily disables the constraint system. The result is not chaos, it is a radical expansion of the information landscape available to consciousness. In 2016, Carhart-Harris published a landmark paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining the brain under psilocybin with then unprecedented imaging resolution. The study found that psilocybin doesn't just suppress the default mode network, it fundamentally alters how the entire brain communicates. Regions that rarely exchange signals begin communicating freely. The rigid, hierarchical structure of normal brain connectivity dissolves into something more fluid, a network topology Carhart-Harris compared to the brain of a deeply experienced meditator. Which brings us to the second path to default mode network silence: meditation. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, neuroscientist Richard Davidson and his team have spent 2 decades studying the brains of experienced meditators, including Tibetan Buddhist monks with tens of thousands of hours of contemplative practice. Using high-density EEG and fMRI, Davidson found that long-term meditators show profound and persistent differences in default mode network activity. The network is quieter at rest, and it deactivates faster when a task begins. Experienced meditators show dramatically reduced activity in the posterior cingulate cortex, the autobiographical hub, compared to novice practitioners. Judson Brewer at Brown University has published extensively on the relationship between meditation and default mode network suppression. His 2011 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences compared experienced meditators with novices across 3 meditation styles: focused attention, loving kindness, and choiceless awareness. In every style tested, experienced meditators showed significantly reduced default mode network activity. Brewer's interpretation was precise. Meditation works not by achieving a state of no thought, but by training the practitioner to observe thoughts without identifying with them. When a thought arises in a novice meditator, the default mode network activates. The thought becomes self-referential, sticky, looping. When a thought arises in an experienced meditator, it arises and passes without triggering the network's self-referential cascade. The narrative self observes the thought rather than becoming it. A 2019 study by Berkovich, Ohana, and colleagues found that long-term meditators show structural differences in the default mode hubs. The physical architecture of the self-referential brain changes over years of practice. The network does not just run differently, it is built differently. You have been living inside this network your entire life. Every quiet moment, every sleepless night at 3 a.m, every involuntary replay of something you wish you had said differently. That has been the network doing its work, sorting, simulating, looping, building and rebuilding the story of who you are. It was not lying to you. It was doing its job, protecting you, modeling your social world, preparing you for threats that feel as real to its algorithms as any predator on any ancient plane. But you are not on the plane, and knowing what is generating those loops changes your relationship to them. The suffering you experience in silence is not a character flaw. It is not weakness or failure or evidence of a broken mind. It is an ancient, metabolically expensive system running evolutionary software in an environment it was never designed for. The loop is not you. It is something that happens in you. And here is what the psilocybin researchers and the meditation neuroscientists both found, arriving from completely opposite directions. When the default mode network goes quiet, what remains is not nothing. It is awareness without commentary, experience without a narrator, the world as it actually is, rather than the model the brain has constructed to manage it. The people who have touched this state, whether through decades of contemplative practice or through the carefully supervised pharmacological suspension of the network, almost universally describe the same thing. Not terror, not emptiness, something closer to homecoming. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent years contemplating what the self actually is, and concluded that once he understood the self as a process, rather than a fixed entity, his fear of death diminished considerably. He wrote that his life had seemed like a glass tunnel, moving through it faster each year, with darkness at the end. When he changed his view, the walls of the glass tunnel disappeared. He seemed to have more room. The default mode network builds the glass tunnel. It constructs the walls of identity, the boundaries of self, the prison of a story you have told about yourself for so long that you have forgotten it is a story. And the extraordinary discovery of the last 2 decades of neuroscience is this: the walls are not load-bearing. They can be seen through. They can, for moments or for a lifetime of practice, be set aside. Not because you are not real, but because what is real in you is older, quieter, and larger than the narrative that runs on top of it. You are not the network. You are what remains when it falls silent.